Welcome to Velvet Chronicles, where every secret changes destiny. Tonight's story begins. He didn't just abandon her. He annulled her, buried her, and replaced her with a porcelain doll in ivory fur, until one frozen morning he found her starving in the mud, 7 months pregnant with the heir he never knew existed. A duke does not beg. He commands. He buys. He turns a blind eye. Alexander Sterling, the Duke of Ravenscourt, had perfected the art of the blind eye. Until a freezing Tuesday in November, parading his flawless new betrothed through the biting London wind. That was the day his meticulously curated world violently fractured. Because there, shivering in the mud, wearing threadbare wool, was his discarded ex-wife. And she was heavily, unmistakably pregnant. The frost that morning did not simply settle. It bit. It clamped down on the cobblestones of Mayfair with teeth of iron. Alexander Sterling, His Grace the Duke of Ravenscourt, felt nothing of the cold. His greatcoat was lined with heavy wool. His boots were bespoke calfskin, thick enough to march through a battlefield. Or in this case, a congested stretch of Piccadilly. A coal wagon had thrown a wheel at the intersection, spilling a sea of black rock and soot across the road. The resulting carriage jam stretched for 1/4 of a mile. "We shall walk, Cordelia," Alexander said, his voice flat. He did not wait for an answer. He opened the carriage door and stepped out into the biting wind. Lady Cordelia Ashford hesitated on the velvet-lined step. She was a vision in ivory and fox fur, a porcelain doll bred for drawing rooms and polite, bloodless conversation. She was exactly the sort of woman a duke was supposed to marry. Uncomplicated, flawless, entirely devoid of the rough, unpredictable edges that could draw blood. "Alexander, it is terribly dirty out there," she murmured. Her gloved hand hovered in the air. He took it. He assisted her down. "It is London, Cordelia. The dirt is part of the architecture." He offered his arm. She took it, leaning her weight against him. They began to navigate the pedestrian walkway, skirting the edges of the frozen sludge. Alexander stared straight ahead. He possessed a striking, angular face, carved from aristocratic boredom and quiet, unrelenting cynicism. He was 32 years old and felt 80. 8 months. It had been exactly 8 months since the ink dried on the ecclesiastical papers dissolving his marriage to Isabel. Isabel. Just the silent thought of her name in his own mind felt like swallowing glass. She had been his rebellion. The daughter of a minor baron, lacking a massive dowry, lacking the perfect pedigree, but possessing a fierce, grounding intelligence that had cut through his world of sycophants. He had married her against the vehement protests of his mother, the Dowager Duchess. He had loved her? Completely. Foolishly. And then, a year into their marriage, the scandal broke. Isabel's father was caught embezzling from the Crown's naval funds. Treason. Ruin. The Dowager Duchess had moved with the swift, merciless precision of a guillotine. She presented Isabel with a choice: annul the marriage on the grounds of non-consummation, a blatant, humiliating lie, and quietly disappear. And in return, the sterling wealth would quietly pay off the stolen funds, saving her father from the gallows. If she refused, the Duke of Ravenscourt would publicly denounce her family, and her father would hang. Alexander hadn't known the truth, not then. He had only seen Isabel walk into his study pale as a ghost and hand him the signed papers. She told him she had never loved him. She told him she had only wanted the title, and now that her family was ruined she could not bear the shame of remaining. She had looked him dead in the eye, her jaw set, and severed his heart from his chest with surgical precision. He had let her go. His pride, wounded and bleeding, had demanded it. Now he was marrying Cordelia. It was a transaction, an alliance of estates. "That man is staring at me, Alexander," Cordelia whispered, pressing closer to his arm. Alexander blinked, pulled back to the present. They had walked further than he intended, veering off the main thoroughfare to bypass the worst of the carriage jam. They were nearing Billingsgate Market. The air here smelled different. Gone was the faint scent of expensive pipe tobacco and hothouse flowers. Here, the air was thick with the smell of roasting chestnuts, damp wool, raw Thames water, and desperation. "Keep your eyes forward," Alexander advised, his tone detached. "They are merely hungry. Fur is a rarity on this street." He wanted to turn back. He hated this part of the city. It reminded him too much of the reality he spent thousands of pounds a year to ignore. But the street behind them was now blocked by a shouting match between two draymen. They had to push forward through the market square. The noise was a physical weight. Costermongers shouting prices for bruised apples and wilted winter greens. The scrape of wooden barrows against stone. The cry of a chimney sweep's boy. Alexander kept his grip on Cordelia tight, steering her like a ship through a treacherous reef. "We will turn up Middlesex Street. There is a hackney stand near." He stopped. He didn't slow down. He didn't pause. He froze entirely, like a clockwork mechanism stripped of its mainspring. "Alexander." Cordelia tugged at his arm. "Alexander, what is it?" "You are hurting my wrist." He didn't hear her. The roar of the market faded into a dull, rushing hum in his ears. His vision narrowed, tunneling through the throng of grey and brown bodies, locking onto a single figure standing by a cheap vegetable stall 20 yards away. She was haggling over a cabbage. It was a bruised, pathetic thing, half frozen and limp. She held it in hands that were raw, chapped red by the biting wind. She wore no gloves. She wore a dress of coarse, slate-grey cotton, hemmed with mud. Over her shoulders was a thin, heavily darned woolen shawl that offered as much protection from the cold as a cobweb. Her dark hair, once curled and pinned with pearls by his own valet, was shoved hastily under a plain working-class bonnet. It was Isabel. Alexander's breath hitched in his throat. A sharp, physical pain slammed into his ribs. It was her. The tilt of her chin, the proud, stubborn line of her neck, the way she shifted her weight when she was arguing. He hadn't seen her in 8 months. He had assumed, when he bothered to allow himself to think of her, that she had retreated to some quiet, modest country cottage. He had sent his solicitor to offer her a pension. The solicitor had returned with the envelope unopened, stamped with a simple return to sender. He thought it was pride. He thought she had funds hidden away. He had never, in his darkest nightmares, imagined her standing in the freezing sludge of the market fighting over rotting vegetables. "Alexander, you are scaring me," Cordelia said. Her voice was shrill, cutting through the static in his head. He ignored her. He took a step forward. Just as his boot hit the cobblestone, Isabel turned slightly to hand a copper coin to the vendor. The wind caught her thin shawl, blowing it back from her frame. Alexander stopped breathing. Beneath the cheap, heavy apron she wore, her stomach was swollen. It was a heavy, undeniable mound. She was pregnant. The world tilted on its axis. The sky, grey and heavy with snow, seemed to press down on his shoulders. He stared at the curve of her belly. 6 months, maybe 7. 7 months. The arithmetic fired through his brain with the cold, lethal speed of a bullet. 8 months ago, she had signed the papers. The night before she walked into his study and broke him, they had shared a bed. She had held him in the dark, her face buried in his chest. It was his. The child she was carrying in the freezing mud, wearing rags, buying garbage to eat, it was his heir, his blood, his child. A wave of nausea hit him so hard he swayed. At that exact moment, as if sensing the absolute collapse of the man standing 20 yards away, Isabel looked up. Her gaze swept over the crowd and landed on him. Time stopped. For a full, agonizing second, they simply looked at each other across the divide of the market. Alexander saw her eyes widen. He saw the flash of shock, the immediate, instinctive flinch. Her hand flew to her stomach, resting protectively on the crest of her unborn child. He expected her to look ashamed. He expected her to weep. He expected her to run. She did none of those things. The shock left her face, replaced by a cold, hardened mask of absolute defiance. She pulled her shoulders back. She lifted her chin. She looked at his heavy wool coat. She looked at the diamond pin in his cravat. She looked at Cordelia, clinging to his arm in ivory fox fur. Alexander felt a sickening surge of self-loathing. He realized exactly what he looked like, the wealthy, untouched Duke parading his pristine new bride, while the woman he had sworn to protect froze in the gutter with his child. He opened his mouth to say, "What?" He didn't know. Her name? A plea? A command? Isabel didn't wait to find out. She took her bruised cabbage, dropped it into a cheap wicker basket, turned her back on him, and began to walk away. She moved heavily, her gait altered by the weight of the pregnancy, disappearing into the crush of bodies heading toward the narrow, lightless alleys of the slums. Isabel, he choked out. The name scraped against his throat. He ripped his arm away from Cordelia. Alexander! Cordelia shrieked, finally realizing he was moving toward the filth. What are you doing? You cannot leave me here. Wait here, he barked, not looking at her. He shoved forward. He hit a costermonger's cart, knocking a pile of turnips into the street. A man yelled. Alexander threw a gold sovereign at him without looking and kept moving. Isabel, he roared. The crowd was too thick. A herd of sheep being driven to market suddenly clogged the junction, a moving wall of dirty wool and bleating bodies. Alexander shoved through them, his bespoke boot sinking into animal muck. He reached the vegetable stall. He looked down the alley where she had vanished. Empty. Shadows and damp brick. She was gone. Alexander stood at the mouth of the alley. The cold wind howled down the narrow passage, biting at his exposed face. His chest heaved. He dragged a trembling hand over his mouth. He had to find her. He had to tear these streets apart brick by brick. He took 3 frantic steps into the gloom before a hand clamped onto the sleeve of his greatcoat. He spun around, ready to strike whoever dared touch him. It was a street urchin, no older than 10. His face smeared with soot. The boy pointed back toward the square. The flash lady is having a fit, Governor, the boy mumbled, eyeing Alexander's gold watch chain. Alexander looked back. Cordelia was backed against a brick wall, surrounded by a few curious onlookers, looking as though she was about to faint from the sheer indignity of her surroundings. She was sobbing. A high, thin sound that grated on Alexander's raw nerves. Duty. The heavy, suffocating chain of aristocratic duty. He could not leave his daughter alone in the market square. It would ruin her. He looked down the empty alley one last time. His jaw locked. His hands curled into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. "I am coming," he muttered. He marched back to Cordelia, grabbed her elbow with more force than necessary, and practically dragged her toward Middlesex Street. He found a hackney cab, shoved a fistful of silver at the driver, and put Cordelia inside. "Take Lady Cordelia to the Ashford townhouse," he ordered the driver. "Alexander, aren't you coming?" Cordelia cried, clutching her fur collar. Her mascara was running. "You left me for what? You saw a ghost." "I have business," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Do not expect me for dinner." He slammed the carriage door. He didn't wait to watch it pull away. He walked back to the vegetable stall. The vendor, a grizzled old man missing half his teeth, looked up warily. Alexander didn't speak. He reached into his pocket, pulled out 2 gold guineas, and slammed them down on the wooden planks. The vendor stared at the coins. That was a month's earnings. "The woman who was just here," Alexander said. His voice was no longer flat. It was low, vibrating with a dangerous, desperate intensity. "The pregnant woman in the grey dress. Who is she? Where does she live?" The vendor licked his lips. She don't talk much, sir. Calls herself Mrs. Hale. Hale? Her mother's maiden name. Where? Alexander demanded. Devil's Acre, the vendor said, pocketing the gold with lightning speed. Top floor of a lodging house above the cooper's shop on Flower and Dean Street. But I wouldn't go there, sir. Not in that coat. They'll slit your throat for the buttons. Alexander turned on his heel. Devil's Acre, the worst slum in London, a labyrinth of disease, violence, and crushing poverty. And she was living there, pregnant. As he walked, his long strides eating up the pavement, the anger began to boil over. But it was not anger at Isabel. It was a vicious, blinding rage directed entirely at himself. He had let pride dictate his life. When she handed him those annulment papers, he hadn't fought. He had let his wounded ego tell him that if she wanted to leave, he wouldn't beg her to stay. He had retreated into the cold, untouchable fortress of his title. He hadn't asked questions. He hadn't investigated. Why had she taken no money? Why had she hidden? The memory of his mother's smug face the day Isabel left suddenly flashed in his mind. The Dowager Duchess had been triumphant. A lucky escape, Alexander. The trash has taken itself out. He stopped dead in the middle of the street, oblivious to a passing cart that nearly clipped his shoulder. His mother. His mother had orchestrated the entire thing. He knew it in his bones. The embezzlement charges against Isabel's father, the swift, quiet dissolution of the marriage. Isabel wouldn't have just walked away and lived in a slum by choice. She was forced. She was threatened. And she had borne the threat in silence to protect him or her family, taking his child into the gutter rather than beg for his help. Alexander looked down at his clean, perfectly manicured hands. He felt sick. He had spent the last 8 months playing the victim, wrapping himself in the luxurious misery of a heartbroken duke. Meanwhile, the woman he loved was freezing, fighting for scraps to feed his unborn child. "I will burn it all down," he whispered to the wind. He didn't care about the scandal. He didn't care about Cordelia. He didn't care if he had to drag the Dowager Duchess into the street and strip her of her allowance. He resumed walking. His pace was relentless. He wasn't the Duke of Ravenscourt anymore. He was a man who had just found out he was bleeding to death, and he was walking toward the only person who could stop it. The transition from the affluent streets to the slums was stark. The pavement vanished, replaced by packed dirt and raw sewage. The buildings leaned over the street, blocking out the grey light. Their windows broken and stuffed with rags. The smell was abominable, a mix of gin, unwashed bodies, and decay. Men with hollow eyes watched him from doorways. Women with painted faces hissed at him from the shadows. Alexander ignored them all. He walked with the terrifying purpose of a predator. He found Flower and Dean Street. He found the cooper's shop, the sharp smell of wood shavings and tar cutting through the stench of the street. Beside it was a narrow, rotting wooden staircase leading up into the darkness. Alexander didn't hesitate. He climbed. The stairs groaned under his weight. At the second landing, a rat scurried over his boot. He kept climbing. He reached the top floor. There was only one door. It hung slightly off its hinges, the wood splintered. Alexander stopped in front of it. His heart, dead and quiet for 8 months, was hammering against his ribs with frantic, painful violence. He raised his hand. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. What if she slammed it in his face? What if she hated him? She has every right to, he thought grimly. He knocked. The knock echoed in the damp, freezing stairwell. It sounded too loud, too violent for the rotting wood of the door. Alexander held his breath. For a long, agonizing minute, there was only silence. He raised his fist to knock again, harder this time, when he heard the faint scuff of a shoe against bare floorboards. The door opened, not fully, just a few meager inches. Isabel stood in the crack. Up close, stripped of the market crowd, the reality of her condition hit Alexander like a physical blow to the stomach. Her face, once round and full of color, was hollowed out. The cheekbones sharp beneath pale, translucent skin. Dark, bruised circles hung heavy under her eyes. She was shivering, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that racked her entire frame. She did not look surprised to see him. She looked utterly, overwhelmingly exhausted. "Go away, Alexander," she said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its usual warmth. She pushed against the door to close it. Alexander reacted on pure instinct. He shoved his heavy, bespoke leather boot into the gap. The wood groaned against the leather. "Isabel, let me in. There is nothing for you here," she said, leaning her weight against the door. It was a futile gesture. He was a broad-shouldered man in the prime of his life. She was a starving, pregnant woman. But the sheer stubbornness of her effort made his chest ache. "I am not leaving this hallway until you open this door," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You can let me in, or I can break the hinges. I do not care which." Isabel stared at him through the gap. Her dark eyes searched his face, looking for the anger, the coldness she had come to expect from him. But there was no coldness left. There was only a desperate, frantic terror. Slowly, she stepped back, letting the door swing open. Alexander stepped over the threshold and felt his heart stop. The room was no larger than his dressing closet at the estate. The walls were weeping with damp. There was a single, narrow bed in the corner, covered in a thin, ragged quilt. A cracked ceramic pitcher sat on a wooden crate. There was a small fireplace, but the grate was dead, filled only with a handful of cold, grey ash. The air inside the room was colder than the street, trapping the winter chill within the brick. This was where she lived. This was where she was preparing to bring his child into the world. He turned to look at her. She stood by the window, her arms wrapped defensively around the heavy swell of her stomach. She refused to meet his eyes. "Have you seen enough?" she asked, her voice dripping with defensive venom. "Has your curiosity been satisfied? You may return to your pristine bride now. You will want to wash your boots." Alexander ignored the barb. He took a step toward her. "How long, Isabel?" "How long what?" "How long have you lived in this squalor?" he demanded, the words tearing out of his throat. "How long have you been starving yourself to buy bruised cabbage in the mud?" She flinched. "I am not starving. I am surviving. It is none of your concern." "It became my concern the moment I saw you in that square." Alexander fired back, closing the distance between them. He stopped just a foot away, towering over her. "You are pregnant. Women get pregnant, Alexander. It is a biological reality. It has nothing to do with you. Do not lie to me." The shout rattled the thin window panes. He didn't mean to yell, but the terror was clawing its way up his throat, choking him. "Do not stand there and tell me that child is not mine. The timeline. The last night before you left. I know it is mine, Isabel. I feel it in my bones." Isabel lifted her chin. The defiance was back, a fragile shield over her breaking body. "The ecclesiastical court declared our marriage unconsummated. You signed the papers agreeing to that fact. Therefore, legally, this child cannot possibly be yours. It is a bastard. A nobody." The words were a direct quote. He recognized the cold, sterile phrasing of his mother's solicitors. The realization slammed into him. "They made you say that?" Alexander whispered, the anger draining away, leaving only horror. My mother, she threatened you." Isabel turned her face away, staring out at the grey, smog-choked sky. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The rigid set of her shoulders, the way she gripped her stomach told him everything. Alexander reached out, moving slowly, deliberately. He unbuttoned his heavy wool greatcoat. He slipped it off his shoulders and stepped closer, draping the massive, fur-lined garment over her shivering frame. She stiffened, trying to pull away. "I don't want your coat. You are freezing," he said, pulling the lapels closed around her, wrapping her in his warmth, his scent. "You are freezing, and you are exhausted, and you are going to put this coat on before I tear this building down with my bare hands." For a moment, she fought him. Her hands pushed against his chest, but the heavy wool was too warm, and the cold had settled too deep into her bones. Her resistance crumbled. She slumped forward slightly, the fight draining out of her. "Why are you here, Alexander?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "You let me go. You didn't even fight for me." The accusation hit him perfectly square in the chest. He closed his eyes, the guilt of physical agony. "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "I know, Isabel, and I will spend the rest of my life paying for it." "You cannot stay here," Alexander said. He had pulled the single, rickety wooden chair from the corner and placed it dead center in the room. He sat down, ignoring the way the wood bowed ominously under his weight. He had no intention of moving. Isabel, swallowed by his greatcoat, sat on the edge of the narrow bed. The warmth of the wool seemed to have temporarily thawed her defenses, leaving behind a terrifying raw vulnerability. She looked impossibly small, save for the swell of her abdomen. "I cannot leave," she said softly, staring at the floorboards. "I paid rent through the end of the month." The absurdity of the statement nearly made Alexander laugh, a dark, hysterical sound that died in his throat. "Rent? You are worried about 3 shillings of rent when you are carrying the heir to a dukedom. He is not an heir," Isabel snapped, a flash of her old fire returning. "He is illegitimate. Your mother made sure of that. If I step foot out of this slum, if I try to lay claim to your name, she will destroy my family. She has the forged ledgers. She has the testimonies. My father will hang for treason, and my sisters will be left destitute." Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, clasping his hands together. "Tell me exactly what she did." Isabel hesitated. She looked at his face, searching for the cynical detachment he always wore like armor. But the Duke of Ravenscourt was gone. The man sitting on the broken chair was just Alexander, the man who had read her poetry in the gardens, the man who had burned his own dinner trying to cook for her on a servant's holiday. "She came to me the day the scandal broke," Isabel said, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper. "Before you even returned from Parliament, she laid the ledgers on my desk. They were perfect forgeries, Alexander, flawless. They implicated my father in stealing naval funds, but worse. They implicated you as his silent partner." Alexander's head snapped up. "Me?" "She said it was the only way to ensure I complied," Isabel continued, her fingers nervously picking at a loose thread on the quilt. "She said if I didn't sign the annulment confessing that our marriage was a sham, she would hand the ledgers to the crown. She would sacrifice you to rid the family of me. She said a few years in the Tower would ruin you, but it would kill my father." The sheer breathtaking cruelty of it stunned him. His own mother. She had weaponized his reputation against his wife. "And the money?" Alexander asked, his voice deadened. "The pension I tried to send you through the solicitor. I never saw it," Isabel said quietly. "Your mother's men watched me for the first month. They made sure I took nothing from the estate. I had my jewelry, but the pawn shops take a steep cut when a woman is alone and desperate. I sold the last of my pearls to pay the midwife in advance." She suddenly gasped, a sharp indrawn breath, and her hand flew to her stomach. She winced, curling slightly forward. Alexander was out of the chair in a heartbeat. He dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch, afraid to break her. "Isabel, what is it? Is it the baby? He kicks." She breathed out, a small pained smile touching the corners of her mouth for the first time. "He does not like the cold, I think. Or perhaps he does not like you yelling." Alexander stared at her hands resting on the swell of her stomach. Slowly, seeking permission with his eyes, he reached out. Isabel didn't pull away. He placed his large, warm hand over hers, pressing gently against the heavy cotton of her apron. For a second, there was nothing. Then a distinct, sharp thump struck against his palm. Life. His child moving, fighting, living beneath his hand in this freezing, rotting room. A tear broke free, tracking hot and fast down Alexander's cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. He kept his hand there, feeling the second, softer movement. The ice that had encased his heart for 8 months shattered completely, leaving him entirely exposed. "I am going to kill her," Alexander whispered, the words a solemn, holy vow. Isabel shook her head. "Alexander, you can't fight her. The forgeries." "I am the Duke of Ravenscourt," Alexander interrupted, his voice hardening into granite. He lifted his head, his eyes burning into hers. "I own the magistrates. I own half of Parliament. I let my mother rule my estate because I was too bored and too arrogant to manage it myself. I let her dictate my life because I thought it didn't matter. But it matters now." He stood up, towering over the bed. He reached down and gently grasped her arms, pulling her to her feet. "We are leaving now." "Alexander, my things. Burn them," he commanded gently. "You will never wear rags again. You will never freeze again. You are coming with me." "Where?" she asked, the fear bleeding back into her voice. "If you take me to the estate, she will know." "I am not taking you to the estate," Alexander said, guiding her toward the splintered door. "I am taking you home." The journey from the rotting heart of Devil's Acre to the quiet, gaslit streets of Mayfair passed in a blur of motion. Alexander had found a decent hackney cab, paying the driver triple his fare to provide a heavy lap rug and drive as smoothly as the cobblestones allowed. Isabel had fallen asleep against his shoulder within minutes, the sheer exhaustion of her existence claiming her the moment she felt safe. Alexander held her tight against his side, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. He watched the dirt and soot on her cheek, a stark contrast to the luxurious wool of his coat. He directed the driver not to the grand Ravenscourt mansion on Grosvenor Square, but to a smaller, discreet townhouse in Bedford Square. It was a property he had inherited from his uncle, a place his mother considered too modest to bother visiting. When the carriage pulled to a halt, Alexander did not wait for the footman. He carried Isabel inside himself, ignoring the shocked gasp of Whitmore, his elderly, fiercely loyal butler. "Whitmore, have Mrs. Whitmore prepare the master suite, light every fire in this house, send a boy for Dr. Hargrove immediately, and tell him to bring his obstetrics bag." Alexander barked, taking the stairs 2 at a time with Isabel in his arms. "At once, Your Grace," Whitmore said, bowing deeply, his eyes darting to the heavily pregnant woman in the Duke's arms. He asked no questions. An hour later, Isabel was asleep in a massive, feather-topped bed, swathed in clean linen and flanked by roaring fires. Dr. Hargrove, a discreet man who owed his practice to Alexander's patronage, had examined her. He pronounced her malnourished and severely fatigued, but the child was strong. Strict bed rest and a heavy diet were prescribed. Alexander stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing. He wanted to stay. He wanted to sit in the armchair by the fire and watch her sleep for the next month, but there was a war to wage. He turned and walked down the stairs. Whitmore was waiting in the foyer, holding Alexander's clean riding coat and a silver tray with a glass of brandy. "Mrs. Whitmore will not leave her side, Your Grace," the butler assured him quietly. Alexander downed the brandy in a single swallow. The burn grounded him. "If anyone comes to this door, anyone, Whitmore, even if they carry the king's seal, you do not let them in. If they force entry, you shoot them. I will take the consequences." "Understood, Your Grace," Whitmore replied, entirely unbothered by the command to commit murder. Alexander stepped out into the night. The carriage was waiting. Grosvenor Square, he told the driver. The Ravenscourt mansion was ablaze with light when he arrived. Carriages lined the driveway. Alexander remembered with a jolt of disgust that his mother was hosting an intimate dinner party to celebrate his betrothal to Cordelia. He stormed through the grand double doors, ignoring the footman who scrambled to take his coat. He was still wearing the clothes he had worn to Devil's Acre, mud splattered on his trousers, smelling faintly of street smoke and cheap tobacco. He walked directly into the grand dining room. The conversation died instantly. 10 of London's most elite aristocrats sat around a mahogany table dripping with silver and crystal. At the head of the table sat the Dowager Duchess Constance. She was a striking woman, her spine made of steel, her neck glittering with the Ravenscourt diamonds. To her right sat Cordelia, looking pale and furious. Alexander, the Dowager said, her voice smooth and chillingly calm. "How kind of you to join us. Cordelia was quite distressed when you abandoned her in the street today like a commoner." Alexander did not sit down. He walked slowly around the edge of the table, his eyes locked onto his mother. The guests watched him, paralyzed by the sheer predatory menace radiating from him. "I have a brief announcement to make to our esteemed guests," Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. He stopped behind Cordelia's chair. "The betrothal between myself and Lady Cordelia is formally dissolved, effective immediately." Cordelia gasped. Her father, Lord Ashford, half rose from his chair. "See here, Ravenscourt." "Sit down, Ashford," Alexander commanded without looking at him. The man slowly sank back into his chair. Alexander turned his full, terrible gaze on his mother. "The wedding is cancelled because I am already married. And I have just spent the afternoon retrieving my wife and my unborn heir from the gutter where you put them." A collective intake of breath sucked the air from the room. The Dowager's face remained a mask of polite confusion. But Alexander saw the slight twitch of a muscle in her jaw, the absolute panic in her eyes. "Alexander, you are unwell. The stress has clouded your mind. Your marriage was legally annulled. Do not insult my intelligence, mother." Alexander interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. He leaned across the table, bracing his hands on the mahogany, invading her space. "I know about the forged ledgers. I know about the threats against her father. I know everything." The Dowager didn't flinch. She leaned in closer, dropping her voice so only he could hear. "You fool. If you bring her back, I will hand those papers to the magistrate tonight. Her family will be destroyed, and you will be dragging a street rat's bastard into this house. Do it." Alexander whispered back, a savage feral smile touching his lips. "Take your forgeries to the magistrate, but understand this, mother. Tomorrow morning, my solicitors will freeze every account you possess. I will strip you of your allowance, your carriages, and your staff. I will banish you to the crumbling dower house in Yorkshire, and I will personally ensure you freeze in the winter." The Dowager stared at him. For the first time in his 32 years, Alexander saw genuine fear in his mother's eyes. She realized, too late, that she had pushed the bored, compliant Duke too far, and awakened something entirely ruthless in his place. "You would ruin your own mother for a penniless whore," she hissed. Alexander stood up straight. He looked down at her as if she were dirt on his boot. "You have 24 hours to vacate this house, mother," Alexander said loudly, ensuring every guest heard. "Leave the diamonds on your dressing table. They belong to my wife." He turned his back on her, walking out of the dining room without a backward glance, leaving the wreckage of his aristocratic life burning beautifully in his wake. The rain began to fall as Alexander Sterling walked out of the Ravenscourt mansion. It was not a gentle, cleansing rain. It was London rain. A freezing, acidic drizzle that pulled the soot from the chimneys and plastered it against the skin. He stood on the pavement of Grosvenor Square for a long moment, ignoring the waiting carriage, letting the cold water hit his face. He had just detonated a bomb in the center of his own life. The reverberations were already spreading. Tomorrow, the clubs would talk of nothing else. By Friday, the scandal sheets would be printing poorly drawn caricatures of him. Lady Cordelia would play the deeply wounded victim. Lord Ashford would likely threaten a duel, realize he was a terrible shot, and settle for demanding a financial settlement for the breach of promise. Alexander did not care. The social architecture of Mayfair felt as flimsy as wet paper. He finally stepped into the hackney cab. Lincoln's Inn Fields he ordered the driver. It was past midnight. The city was shuttering itself against the weather. By the time the cab rattled to a halt in front of a narrow, respectable brick building, the street was entirely dead. Alexander did not knock on the front door. He walked around to the side alley, found a specific iron knocker on a reinforced oak door, and slammed it down 3 times. He waited. He knocked again, harder. A bolt scraped back. The door cracked open, revealing a sliver of yellow candlelight and the deeply unamused face of Mr. Jonathan Wexley. The solicitor was a man who looked exactly like his profession. Sharp, dry, and entirely devoid of sentiment. He wore a heavy dressing gown and a nightcap, though his eyes were instantly alert. "Your Grace," Wexley said, his voice flat. He did not seem surprised. When one managed the legal affairs of a dukedom, midnight visits were an occupational hazard. "It is raining." "I am aware, Wexley." "Let me in." Wexley stepped back. Alexander walked into the narrow hallway, shedding his wet coat and leaving it on a wooden peg. He followed the solicitor into a study choked with the smell of old parchment, binding glue, and stale port. "I require a series of immediate legal actions," Alexander said, not bothering to sit. He moved to the small fireplace, holding his hands out to the dying embers. "First, the Dowager Duchess is to be stripped of all financial access. I want her signature invalidated at the Bank of England, Coutts, and every private lending house in the city. Her allowance is severed. Her credit is 0. Wexley walked over to his desk, struck a match, and lit an oil lamp. He pulled out a fresh sheet of foolscap. He did not ask why. He simply dipped his pen. "Effective when?" "Effective yesterday. By morning, I want it so that she cannot buy a loaf of bread on my credit." "Done," Wexley murmured, writing in a rapid, spidery script. "And the properties?" "She is banished to the Dower House in Yorkshire. The staff there is to be reduced to a skeleton crew. 3 servants, no carriage, no horses. If she attempts to enter any other Ravenscourt property, she is to be removed by the constabulary as a trespasser." Wexley paused. He looked up, the quill hovering over the paper. The cynicism in the older man's eyes met the absolute coldness in Alexander's. "Your Grace, to cut off a Dowager Duchess so violently. She will not go quietly. She will retaliate. Have you considered the leverage she might possess? She possesses forged naval ledgers implicating the late Baron Hartley in treason." Alexander said flatly. The words tasted like ash. "She has threatened to turn them over to the Crown Magistrate to destroy his family." Wexley did not flinch. He carefully placed the pen back in its inkwell. He understood the game now. It was not a family squabble. It was mutually assured destruction. "Forged ledgers," the solicitor repeated slowly. "If they are well executed, the Crown will not care if they are fake. They will hang the Baron first and ask questions later. The Admiralty is hungry for a scapegoat this year. I will dismantle the forgery," Alexander said. "But I needed to cut off her power first. She operates through my wealth. I am removing the weapon from her hand. And the annulment, Your Grace." Alexander closed his eyes. The memory of Isabel shivering in that rotting room hit him again. Burn it. Shred it. The annulment was coerced. Isabel is my wife. She is currently residing at the Bedford Square townhouse. She is pregnant with my heir. Wexley's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. That was the equivalent of a shocked gasp from anyone else. "I see," Then we must draft a new will. Immediately. Establishing the child's legitimacy and naming you as the sole executor of its welfare, should you meet an untimely end at the hands of Lord Ashford or an angry dowager. Draft it. Alexander commanded. I will sign it before I leave. An hour later, Alexander walked back out into the freezing rain. His pockets were lighter, his legal standing radically altered. He had stripped his mother of her armor. Now he had to go hunt for her sword. When the carriage finally returned him to Bedford Square, the house was entirely silent. Whitmore was asleep in a chair in the foyer, an ancient flintlock pistol resting on his lap. The old butler jolted awake as Alexander entered, smoothly hiding the weapon beneath a copy of the Times. Is she sleeping? Alexander asked quietly, shrugging off his damp coat. She woke an hour ago, Your Grace. Mrs. Whitmore prepared some beef broth. She ate a little. She is awake now. Alexander nodded. He walked up the stairs. His boots felt heavy. The adrenaline of the evening was fading, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He pushed open the door to the master suite. The room was sweltering, the fires roaring in the grates. Isabel was sitting up in the massive bed, propped against a mountain of pillows. She wore one of his large white linen shirts, the cuffs rolled up to her elbows. The fine fabric swallowed her frail frame, but the color in her cheeks was slightly better. The haunting grey pallor of the slum had faded to a fragile porcelain. She looked at him as he entered. She did not smile. She did not look relieved. She looked terrified. You did it, didn't you? She asked. Her voice was barely a whisper, thick with sleep and fear. Alexander stopped at the foot of the bed. He looked at her dark hair against the white pillows, at the heavy swell of his child beneath the blankets. He had no desire to lie to her. He would never lie to her again. I dissolved the betrothal in front of the entire dining room, he said softly. I told them you are my wife. I ordered her out of the house by morning. Her accounts are frozen. Isabel closed her eyes. A tear slipped free, tracking down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of joy. It was the terrified weeping of a woman watching a firing squad load their rifles. She will ruin my father, Alexander. She warned me. She promised me. Alexander walked around the bed. He sat on the edge of the mattress, careful not to crowd her. He reached out and took her hand. It was warmer now. The chill of the street finally driven out of her skin. She will not. Alexander said. His voice was an iron vow. I will not let her. You don't know her. Isabel sobbed, pulling her hand away to cover her face. You grew up ignoring her. I saw her up close. I saw the way she smiled when she handed me those ledgers. She enjoys the cruelty, Alexander. She will destroy my sisters. They will be destitute. My father will hang. Isabel, look at me. She shook her head, crying into her palms. The stress was tearing at her. She curled inward, her breath hitching in a way that terrified him. Alexander leaned forward. He gently but firmly pulled her hands away from her face. He forced her to look at him. I was a coward, Alexander said. The confession scraped his throat raw. When you handed me those papers 8 months ago, I was a coward. I let my pride blind me. I let you walk away because I was too arrogant to fight for you. And too blind to see what was happening in my own home. I let you freeze in a slum. He swallowed hard, fighting the tightening in his chest. I cannot undo that. I will spend the rest of my life trying to apologize for it, but I am not that man anymore. I am not the bored aristocrat who lets his mother run his life. I tore my world apart tonight because I would rather burn London to the ground than see you cry like this again. I will fix this. Isabel stared at him. Her chest heaved. The terror in her eyes was warring with something else, a desperate, fragile hope. She hated hoping. hoping in the slums got you killed. How? She whispered. How can you fix it? The ink is already dry on those ledgers. Alexander's jaw tightened. Ink can be bought, and so can the men who spill it. Rest, Isabel. Keep my son safe. I will bring you the ashes of those ledgers before the sun sets tomorrow. London had a dark underbelly, a subterranean world of vice, forgery, and violence that existed entirely to service the pristine aristocracy living above it. Gentlemen of the ton did not forge their own documents, just as they did not slaughter their own meat. They hired professionals. Alexander did not sleep. At dawn, he left Bedford Square dressed in plain dark clothing, devoid of his usual diamonds and silk. He took a heavy oak walking stick with a lead-weighted handle. He walked to a high-end gentleman's club on St. James's Street, not his own, but one known for turning a blind eye to high-stakes gambling and ruined men. He found exactly who he was looking for, sitting alone in a corner booth nursing a glass of gin at 7 in the morning. Lord Pemberton. A man who owed Alexander's estate over £4,000 in gambling debts. A man who intimately knew the men who operated in the shadows. Alexander slid into the leather booth opposite Pemberton. The ruined lord blanched, his hand trembling as he set his glass down. Ravenscourt, I swear the funds are coming from my estate in Cornwall. The harvest was. I don't care about the money, Pemberton. Alexander interrupted. His voice was low, cutting through the stale air of the club. Consider the debt forgiven, completely erased, provided you give me a name. Pemberton blinked, staring at Alexander as if he had lost his mind. A name? My mother required a specialist about a year ago. Alexander said, leaning forward. A man capable of forging Admiralty seals and perfectly replicating handwriting. She would not have found this man herself. She would have used a proxy. Someone desperate for cash, someone who knew the rookeries, someone like you. Pemberton's pale face turned the color of chalk. He looked wildly around the empty club room. Ravenscourt, if I cross the Dowager. Alexander reached across the table. His hand shot out, grabbing Pemberton by the lapels of his coat, dragging the smaller man halfway across the mahogany table. My mother has been stripped of her power. Alexander whispered, his face inches from Pemberton's. She is broken, banished. I am the Duke of Ravenscourt. I hold your debt. I hold your social standing in the palm of my hand. If you do not give me the name of the forger, I will ruin you before noon. You will be in a debtor's prison by nightfall. Pemberton swallowed. The smell of gin and fear radiated from him. Blackwell. His name is Ezra Blackwell. He operates out of a print shop in Cripplegate, Silver Street. The sign says he binds Bibles. Alexander let him go. Pemberton collapsed back into his seat, gasping for air. Alexander stood up, straightened his coat, and walked out without another word. Cripplegate was a different kind of poverty than Devil's Acre. It was industrial. The air here was thick with the smell of dye, tanning chemicals, and cheap coal. The print shop on Silver Street was a narrow, cramped building, its windows heavily frosted with grime. Alexander kicked the door open. It wasn't locked. The shop smelled of lead-type and oil. A small ferret-faced man with ink-stained fingers looked up from a heavy iron printing press. He took one look at Alexander's broad shoulders, his tailored coat, and the heavy oak walking stick, and he immediately bolted for the back door. He didn't make it. Alexander moved with lethal speed, closing the distance and catching the man by the scruff of his neck. He threw Blackwell backward. The forger crashed into a stack of unbound paper, sliding to the floor in a shower of white sheets. Mr. Blackwell, I presume. Alexander said quietly. He walked over and stood above the terrified man, tapping the lead-weighted end of his walking stick rhythmically against the floorboards. I ain't done nothing. Blackwell squeaked, holding his hands up to protect his face. I'm a legitimate businessman. You bound a very specific piece of fiction for the Dowager Duchess of Ravenscourt last spring. Alexander stated. Naval ledgers, replicating the handwriting of Baron Hartley. Blackwell's eyes darted left and right, looking for an exit. I don't know no duchesses. Alexander stopped tapping the stick. He knelt down, bringing himself to Blackwell's eye level. He didn't yell. The terrifying calmness of his demeanor was far worse than rage. Listen to me very carefully, Mr. Blackwell. I do not care about your petty crimes. I do not care about the blackmail you run on minor lords. But you touched my wife's family. You touched my house. I have a carriage waiting outside. In my pocket, I have a bank draft for £1,000. Blackwell's eyes widened at the sum. It was enough to buy a small estate in the country. It was enough to flee to America and live like a king. However, Alexander continued, his voice dropping to a silken threat, if you lie to me, if you protect my mother, I will drag you out of this shop by your hair. I will haul you to the Bow Street runners. I will personally ensure the magistrate knows you forge admiralty seals. They will hang you, Mr. Blackwell. Slowly. Alexander pulled the bank draft from his pocket and held it between his fingers. The money and passage on a ship to Boston tonight, or the gallows. Choose. Blackwell stared at the paper. The greed won over the fear. It always did. She gave me letters. Blackwell babbled, scrambling to his knees. Letters the Baron wrote to her husband years ago, to copy the handwriting. I kept them. I always keep the originals. Insurance, you see, in case the rich folk decide they don't want to pay the final bill. Give them to me. Alexander commanded. And the practice sheets. An assigned confession detailing exactly who paid you to forge the letters. 10 minutes later, Alexander walked out of the print shop. Tucked securely inside his coat was a heavy manila envelope containing the absolute destruction of his mother's plot. He took the carriage back to Grosvenor Square. The Ravenscourt mansion was in a state of chaotic dismantling. Trunks were lined up in the massive foyer. Servants were rushing about, looking terrified. The Dowager Duchess stood at the bottom of the grand staircase, wearing a heavy travelling cloak, directing a footman carrying a portrait. She saw Alexander enter. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, venomous hatred. You have made your point, Alexander. She spat, her voice echoing in the marble hall. You have humiliated me. You have frozen my life. But if you think I will let you bring that gutter trash back into this family. Alexander didn't speak. He walked calmly across the foyer. The servants instinctively backed away, sensing the violence radiating from him. He stopped in front of his mother. He reached into his coat. He pulled out the manila envelope. He opened it, withdrew a single sheet of paper, Blackwell's signed confession, and held it up for her to read. The Dowager's eye scanned the words. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking old, fragile, and utterly defeated. The steel spine collapsed. Blackwell is currently on a ship to Boston. Alexander said, his voice quiet, meant only for her. I have the original letters you gave him. I have his practice drafts. The forgery is dead. The Dowager stared at the paper. Her lips trembled. Alexander, please. If this gets out, my reputation. You have no reputation. Alexander said, his voice entirely devoid of pity. You are a ghost. You will go to Yorkshire. You will never set foot in London again. You will never write to me. You will never approach my wife, nor my child. If you ever speak Isabel's name again, I will have this confession printed in the Times. He turned the paper around, folded it neatly, and placed it back in the envelope. The carriage is waiting, Mother. Alexander said. He turned his back on her, walking toward the front doors. To try to survive the winter. The winter broke late in March, dissolving the bitter frost into a heavy, relentless dampness. But inside the townhouse at Bedford Square, the chill had been permanently banished. Healing, however, was not an event. It was a brutal, grueling process. Bringing Isabel out of Devil's Acre was easy. Pulling Devil's Acre out of Isabel took months. In the beginning, the trauma manifested in quiet, heartbreaking ways. Alexander would wake in the middle of the night to find her out of bed, sitting by the fire, hoarding small pieces of bread wrapped in napkins inside her dressing gown pockets. She was terrified of going hungry again. He didn't mention it. He didn't shame her. He simply made sure the kitchens always left fresh pastries in her sitting room, silently reinforcing that the starvation was over. Trust was harder to rebuild than physical health. Isabel was wary of him. She had seen him turn his ruthless power against his own mother. She knew what he was capable of. They spent their evenings in the small library, sitting by the fire. Sometimes they talked. Often they sat in silence, the heavy weight of their shared history filling the room. Alexander didn't push. He sat beside her. He read to her. He placed his hand on her swollen stomach when she allowed it, feeling the violent, joyous kicking of their son. He showed her, day by day, that he was an anchor, not a storm. The crisis came in early April, during a violent spring thunderstorm. The pain hit Isabel suddenly, snapping her awake with a choked scream. Alexander was out of his chair in a second. He had taken to sleeping on a small settee in her room, refusing to be relegated to a separate wing of the house. He lit the lamps. Her face was pale, slick with sweat, her hands gripping the bedsheet so tightly her knuckles were translucent. "Alexander!" She gasped, her eyes wide with primal panic. "It's time. It's too early, Alexander. It's time." "It is not too early, my love. You are ready," he said, though his own heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He rang the bell pull violently. The house erupted into organized chaos. Mrs. Whitmore arrived with hot water and clean linens. A footman was dispatched into the storm to fetch Dr. Hargrove. For the next 10 hours, the townhouse was a battlefield. Alexander refused to leave the room. Society dictated that men wait in a drawing room with a glass of brandy, shielded from the messy, agonizing reality of birth. Alexander dismissed the tradition with a curse. He stripped off his coat, rolled up his shirt sleeves, and sat on the edge of the bed. He held her hand. He wiped the sweat from her brow. He watched the woman he loved endure an agony that made the political maneuverings of Parliament look like child's play. Isabel squeezed his hand, her nails biting into his skin deeply enough to draw blood. He didn't flinch. He leaned close to her ear, murmuring useless, desperate words of comfort. "I am here. I am right here. You are safe." "I can't," she sobbed, tossing her head against the pillows. The physical toll of her time in the slums had weakened her reserves. "Alexander, I can't do this. I'm so tired." "You can," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. He pressed his forehead against hers. "You survived the freezing streets. You survived my mother. You are the strongest creature I have ever known, Isabel. Bring him here. Bring our son home." It was a grueling, terrifying fight. The storm raged outside, rattling the window panes, masking the sounds of her labor. And then, just as the grey light of dawn broke through the heavy clouds, the room fell still. The agonizing tension snapped. A sharp, furious cry pierced the air. Alexander stopped breathing. He looked down. Dr. Hargrove was smiling, holding a small, red, incredibly noisy bundle. "A boy, Your Grace," the doctor said, wrapping the infant in a warm towel. "A very loud, very healthy boy." Alexander felt a physical break inside his chest. The last remnants of the cynical, untouchable Duke of Ravenscourt shattered entirely, replaced by a devastating, overwhelming love. He watched as the doctor placed the child on Isabel's chest. She looked down at the tiny, thrashing face, and the exhaustion melted from her features, replaced by a radiant, blinding awe. She touched the baby's cheek with a trembling finger. Alexander leaned over them, wrapping his large arms around both of them, enclosing them in a fortress of his own body. He buried his face in Isabel's damp hair, his shoulders shaking as the tears finally came. He had almost lost this. He had almost let his pride and his mother's cruelty rob him of his universe. "We have him, Alexander," Isabel whispered, looking up at him, her dark eyes shining with tears. The walls between them, the lingering doubts, the ghosts of Devil's Acre, they dissolved in the sheer reality of the life between them. "I have you," Alexander corrected softly, kissing her forehead. He reached down and gently touched his son's tiny, grasping hand. The baby's fingers curled tightly around Alexander's thumb, a grip of surprising strength. He was not a duke at that moment. He was a father. He was a husband. He was a man who had walked through the fire and finally pulled his family out of the ashes. The Duke of Ravenscourt burned his own empire to the ground, but from the ashes he forged something entirely unbreakable. Alexander and Isabel survived the absolute worst of high society, proving that true loyalty is not inherited, it is earned in the absolute darkest of trenches. Their newborn son will inherit a legacy of iron and truth, rather than lies and velvet.